Thaddeus Blackwell stood at the bus stop, his impatience growing with each passing minute. The gray Seattle autumn draped the world around him in a dreary cloak. Leaves rustled underfoot, and the sky hung low, threatening rain. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at his watch. Why was the bus always late? He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, feeling the chill seep into his bones. As he scanned the street, his gaze landed on the bus driver pulling up to the stop. Robert was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a weary expression, his face etched with lines that spoke of long hours and hard days. Thaddeus couldn't help but feel a smirk creep onto his face. Here was a man who seemed to have given up on life, a mere cog in the machine that kept the city moving. "Look at you," Thaddeus called out, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Another day, another failure, huh?" He reveled in the power he felt, enjoying the brief moment of superiority. Robert met his gaze, the corners of his mouth twitching into a small, calm smile. "Every job has its worth, kid," he replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the exhaustion that lay beneath the surface. Thaddeus's smirk faltered for a moment, surprised by the older man's composure. What could a bus driver know about worth? Yet there was something in Robert's eyes, a flicker of resilience that caught him off guard. The encounter lingered in Thaddeus's mind, but he quickly dismissed it. He had a reputation to uphold, and he wouldn't let a simple bus driver shake his confidence. As the bus doors swung open, Thaddeus boarded, throwing a glance back at Robert. "Hope you're ready for another boring day," he sneered, taking his usual seat near the front. Robert shrugged. "Every day has its surprises, kid." Thaddeus rolled his eyes, staring out the window as the bus lurched forward. He watched the streets blur by, his thoughts swirling. Why did he even care about Robert? The man was nobody, just a driver, and Thaddeus was the heir to a fortune. Yet, part of him wondered about the life Robert led, the struggles hidden behind that calm facade. Days turned into a routine, with Thaddeus riding Robert's bus each morning. The cruel banter continued, but as Thaddeus observed Robert's interactions with other passengers, something began to shift. Robert treated everyone with kindness, whether they were rude or polite. He listened to complaints, offered friendly smiles, and showed patience that Thaddeus found both foreign and admirable. "Why do you let them walk all over you?" Thaddeus blurted out one morning, frustration creeping into his tone. Robert chuckled softly. "Not everyone understands the weight they carry, son. Sometimes, a little kindness can go a long way." Thaddeus frowned, grappling with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Was it envy, respect, or perhaps something deeper, a realization that his arrogance was a mask for his own insecurities? He looked around the bus at the other passengers, all lost in their own worlds, and suddenly, he felt small. The contrast between his privileged life and Robert's humble existence gnawed at him. Each laugh, each shared moment between Robert and the passengers chipped away at the walls Thaddeus had built around himself. "Do you ever regret it?" Thaddeus asked one day, his voice quieter than usual. "This job?" Robert met his gaze in the rearview mirror, a knowing look in his eyes. "Regret is for those who don't see the beauty in the small things. I find joy in driving these streets, connecting with people." Thaddeus pondered this as the bus rolled through the city. Could he ever find joy in something so simple? He wanted to dismiss Robert's words, to laugh them off as the ramblings of a man resigned to his fate. But deep down, he felt a flicker of understanding. The question remained, would he allow that flicker to grow, or would he snuff it out with arrogance? In that moment, as the bus continued its journey through the rain-soaked streets, Thaddeus faced a crossroads. Would he choose to remain the arrogant heir, or would he consider the possibility of something more? The answer hung in the air, heavy with anticipation. As the days passed, Thaddeus Blackwell found himself stepping onto Robert's bus each morning, the familiar sound of the door hissing closed behind him. The weight of his earlier arrogance still lingered in the air, an invisible cloud that followed him as he settled into his usual seat. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something had shifted within him, though he was not ready to admit it. The bus rattled down the damp streets of Seattle, and Thaddeus took his place among the passengers, a mix of students and workers, each lost in their own world. Robert, the middle-aged driver, greeted everyone with a warm smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Thaddeus watched him closely, trying to pinpoint what made this man different from everyone else. "Good morning, folks. Let's make it a great day," Robert called out cheerfully as he pulled away from the stop. Thaddeus watched as Robert navigated through the traffic with an ease that seemed to come from years of experience. It was more than just driving. It was as though he carried a sense of duty with him, a quiet pride in his work. Thaddeus leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, feeling a sense of superiority. He turned to his friend sitting beside him, a smirk forming on his lips. "Look at him. Just a bus driver. Must be nice to have such low expectations in life," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. His friend chuckled, but Thaddeus noticed that the laughter didn't come from a place of genuine humor. Instead, it felt forced. He glanced back at Robert, who was focused on the road, seemingly unfazed by Thaddeus's comment. There was something unsettling about Robert's calm demeanor. It made Thaddeus uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite understand. The days turned into a routine, and Thaddeus continued to ride the bus, each trip revealing more of Robert's character. Thaddeus observed how Robert treated the other passengers. He was patient with the elderly who struggled to board, his voice gentle as he offered assistance. When a group of rowdy teenagers made a scene, Robert simply smiled and reminded them of the rules without raising his voice. "Hey, keep it down back there," Robert said one day, his tone firm yet kind. "Respect goes both ways, all right?" The teenagers quieted down, surprised by his unexpected approach. Thaddeus couldn't help but feel a twinge of respect for Robert, though he quickly buried that feeling under layers of pride. As Thaddeus continued to witness these interactions, he found his own arrogance beginning to chip away. Why does he even bother? He thought, puzzled. It's not like they appreciate it. Yet, the more he watched, the more he realized that Robert seemed to find joy in his kindness, a joy that was missing from Thaddeus's own life. One morning, as the bus lurched forward, Thaddeus caught a glimpse of Robert in the rearview mirror. The driver's eyes reflected a weariness that spoke of long hours and struggles. It struck Thaddeus that Robert was not just a bus driver, he was a man carrying burdens he didn't voice. It was an unsettling realization that left Thaddeus feeling exposed. In the evenings, after his long days at school, Thaddeus would often replay the bus rides in his mind. He felt a growing discomfort with his own behavior. He craved the power that came from mocking Robert, yet he also felt a strange urge to understand the man he had belittled. It was a conflict that gnawed at him, leaving him restless. "Why do I care what he thinks?" Thaddeus muttered to himself one afternoon as he walked home. But deep down, he knew the answer was more complicated than he wanted to admit. The gap between his privileged life and Robert's struggles began to loom larger in his mind, a chasm filled with questions that felt too heavy to address. On the bus the next day, Thaddeus sat quietly, observing Robert as he navigated through the city. Suddenly, he caught Robert's eye in the mirror. The driver smiled, and for a brief moment, Thaddeus felt a connection that had nothing to do with power or status. It was a simple understanding, a silent acknowledgement of their shared humanity. "Have a good day, Thaddeus," Robert said, his voice warm and genuine. For the first time, Thaddeus found himself at a loss for words. Instead of responding with a sharp comment, he merely nodded, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through him. It was just a small moment, but it marked the beginning of a shift within him, one that he could no longer ignore. The autumn air felt heavy as Thaddeus boarded the bus once again. It was a familiar routine, yet today felt different. He could still hear the echo of his own words from the previous day, words that had cut deep into Robert's heart. As he took his seat near the back, he avoided looking at the bus driver, who was already staring ahead, his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Thaddeus couldn't shake off the image of Robert's tears. The man he had mocked was not just a bus driver. He was a father, a man with hopes and dreams. "Why did I say that?" Thaddeus thought bitterly. He He felt a strange mix of guilt and confusion swirling inside him. The sharpness of his arrogance had turned into a dull ache. "Good morning, Thaddeus," Robert said, his voice steady as he greeted the passengers. Unlike the previous days, there was no hint of the weariness that often marked his expressions. Instead, he seemed to have a quiet strength about him, as if he was determined not to let anyone, especially Thaddeus, break him. "Hey," Thaddeus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He watched as Robert engaged warmly with other passengers, asking them about their day and offering a smile that seemed genuine. Thaddeus felt the weight of his own behavior pressing down on him. As they drove through the city, Thaddeus's mind raced. He glanced at Robert, who was focused on the road, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Thaddeus knew he had to say something, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Finally, he spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry for what I said yesterday." Robert turned his head slightly, surprised by the admission. "Apology accepted," he said simply, keeping his eyes on the road. "But you need to understand, words have power. They can hurt more than you realize." Thaddeus nodded, feeling the truth of those words sink in. "I didn't mean to hurt you, I just thought—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I thought I was better than you. I didn't see how hard your life is." Robert let out a small sigh, the weight of his responsibilities evident in his expression. "It's easy to look down on others when you don't know their story, but everyone has struggles. My daughter, for example, she dreams of going to college. I work long hours to make that happen for her." Thaddeus felt a pang of regret. He hadn't thought about Robert's daughter before. "I didn't know," he admitted softly. "I just wanted to feel powerful, to show off in front of my friends." Robert glanced at him, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "You don't need to bring others down to feel important, Thaddeus. Real strength comes from lifting others up." The bus turned a corner, and the city unfolded outside the windows. Thaddeus looked at the people passing by, some with smiles, others with frowns. He began to see them as more than just faces in the crowd. Each one had their own battles, their own stories. "I want to change," Thaddeus said, his voice firmer now. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Robert nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "That's a good start. Change takes time, but it begins with understanding. Try to see the world through other people's eyes." As they continued their journey, Thaddeus felt a shift within himself. He started to notice the little things: the elderly woman struggling with her bags, the young boy excitedly pointing out the sights to his mother. He realized that these moments mattered. "Thank you, Robert," Thaddeus said, sincerity pouring from him, "for being patient with me." Robert smiled, his eyes warm. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Thaddeus. Just remember, it's your actions from now on that will define who you are." The bus rolled to a stop, and the passengers began to disembark. Thaddeus took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in days. As he stepped off the bus, he knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face it. For the first time, he felt a spark of hope, a hope that he could become a better person, one who understood the importance of empathy and kindness. In the days that followed the painful confrontation, Thaddeus Blackwell found himself lost in thought. He sat in his room, the walls closing in around him like the dark, heavy clouds outside. The echoes of Robert's tears haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bus driver's face, twisted with emotion and hurt. "What have I done?" Thaddeus whispered to himself, feeling the weight of his arrogance settle heavily on his chest. As he walked to the bus stop each morning, he noticed the world around him more than ever before. The laughter of children playing in the park, the way an elderly woman struggled with her groceries, and the tired expression on Robert's face each time he stepped onto the bus. All these moments seemed to shine a light on the privilege that Thaddeus had taken for granted. "I was so blind," he thought, shaking his head as he waited for the bus to arrive. When he boarded the bus, he felt a mix of apprehension and guilt. The familiar sound of the engine was now a reminder of his past mistakes. The usual chatter of passengers faded into the background as he searched for Robert. The driver sat at the front, his hands gripping the wheel with a steady calmness. Thaddeus took a seat near the back, his heart racing. "Good morning," Robert said, his voice even and warm as he greeted the passengers. Thaddeus could see the kindness in Robert's eyes, even after the hurt he had caused. It made him feel smaller, like a child caught doing something wrong. Thaddeus wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Days passed, and Thaddeus continued to ride the bus, each time hoping for the right moment to talk to Robert. He watched how the driver treated everyone with respect, even those who were rude or dismissive. One day, he saw a young girl drop her book as she rushed off the bus. Robert quickly picked it up and called out, "Hey, you forgot this." The girl turned around, her face lighting up with a smile. "Thank you," she shouted as she grabbed the book and ran away. Witnessing this simple act of kindness stirred something within Thaddeus. "He's so strong," he thought. "How can he be so nice after what I said?" It was a moment of clarity, and Thaddeus realized that Robert had found the strength to rise above his pain. Later that week, the bus was nearly empty. Thaddeus felt a surge of courage. He took a deep breath and stood up, making his way to the front of the bus. Robert was checking the rearview mirror when he noticed Thaddeus approach. "Hey, kid," he said with a nod. "Robert?" Thaddeus started, his voice shaking slightly. I need to talk to you." Robert turned his full attention to him, his expression open and patient. "Sure, what's on your mind?" "I'm really sorry for what I said that day. It was terrible. I didn't think about how my words could hurt you. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I feel awful," Thaddeus admitted, his eyes searching Robert's for any sign of anger. Robert paused, taking a moment to consider Thaddeus's words. "You know, it's not easy to hear those things, but I appreciate you saying that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he replied, his voice steady. Thaddeus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he also felt the weight of his guilt. "I want to be better. I don't want to be that person anymore," he said earnestly. Robert nodded slowly. "It's a journey, Thaddeus. We all have our struggles. Just remember that kindness is powerful. It can change lives." "I'll try to remember that," Thaddeus said, a sense of determination rising within him. As the bus continued its route, Thaddeus felt lighter. The conversation with Robert opened his eyes to the possibility of change. He realized that understanding and compassion were not just words. They were choices he could make every day. That day marked a shift in Thaddeus's heart. He wanted to learn from Robert, to understand more about the world outside his bubble of privilege. He was ready to embrace a new path, one where empathy guided his actions. The once arrogant heir was beginning to see the beauty in connection, and for the first time, he looked forward to the journey ahead. As the gray Seattle skies began to clear slightly, Thaddeus Blackwell felt a knot of anxiety twist in his stomach. He had spent the past few days replaying his harsh words to Robert, the bus driver, and the memory of Robert's tearful reaction haunted him. Today was different. He had made up his mind. He would apologize. With each step toward the bus stop, Thaddeus's heart raced. He could see the familiar blue bus approaching, its engine humming softly as it drew closer. Robert was behind the wheel, his face lined with weariness, but also a hint of warmth. Thaddeus took a deep breath and stepped aboard. The bus was nearly empty. A couple of passengers sat toward the back, absorbed in their own worlds. Thaddeus moved to the front, his palms clammy against the metal pole. As he reached Robert, he felt the weight of his arrogance from the past pressing down on him. Robert?" Thaddeus began, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert met his gaze, his expression neutral but curious. "Yes, Thaddeus. Everything okay?" Thaddeus swallowed hard. "I wanted to talk to you about what I said the other day. I was really out of line." Robert nodded slowly, as if giving Thaddeus space to find the right words. Go on. I called you a failure, Thaddeus continued, his voice shaking slightly. I was wrong. I didn't know anything about you or your life. I wanted to feel better about myself. Robert's eyes softened. You know, Thaddeus, sometimes people lash out because they struggle with their own insecurities. I've been there too. Thaddeus blinked in surprise. You have? Of course, Robert replied, leaning back a bit in his seat. Everyone has their battles. My daughter has dreams, and I work hard to support her. I don't want her to feel the weight of my struggles. Thaddeus felt a rush of shame wash over him. I didn't think about that. I just wanted to look strong in front of my friends. I didn't consider how my words could hurt someone. Robert smiled gently. It takes strength to admit when you're wrong. Not many people can do that. Thaddeus felt a flicker of hope. So, you're not mad at me? Mad? No, Robert replied, shaking his head. I believe in forgiveness. We all make mistakes. It's how we learn from them that matters. Thaddeus felt a wave of relief. Thank you for understanding. I promise I will try to be better. I want to use my privilege to help others, not to put them down. That's a good start, Robert said, his voice steady. Remember, Thaddeus, words have power. They can lift someone up or tear them down. Choose wisely. I will, Thaddeus promised, feeling a newfound sense of purpose. Maybe I can help you with your daughter's dreams. I know people who could support her. Robert's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the offer. You'd do that? Yes, I want to change, Thaddeus replied earnestly. I want to make things right. Robert nodded, his expression shifting to one of encouragement. That's the spirit. Just remember, it's not just about fixing things. It's about understanding and connection. As the bus rolled through the streets of Seattle, Thaddeus felt lighter than he had in a long time. The sounds of the city faded into the background as he and Robert shared a moment of genuine connection. The bus felt different now, filled with a new kind of energy. Thank you for talking to me, Thaddeus said, his voice filled with sincerity. I really appreciate it. Robert smiled warmly. Anytime, Thaddeus. We're all in this together. Just keep moving forward. Thaddeus nodded, a sense of determination rising within him. He knew he had a long way to go, but this moment felt like a turning point. As they continued on their journey, he resolved to embrace the lessons of empathy and kindness that Robert had shared. It was time to step into a new chapter, one filled with understanding and respect for others. Days turned into weeks, and Thaddeus Blackwell found himself on the bus, feeling different. The weight of his previous actions lingered in his mind, but he was determined to change. Each time he stepped onto that bus, he reminded himself of Robert's tears and the pain he had caused. It was a new beginning, and Thaddeus wanted to make it count. As he boarded the bus one chilly morning, he noticed Robert in the driver's seat, his face lined with focus and calm. Thaddeus took a deep breath. Good morning, Robert, he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of nervousness. Robert looked up and smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across his features. Good morning, Thaddeus. How are you today? I'm better. I've been thinking a lot, Thaddeus replied, his heart racing. He took a seat near the front, ready to engage in a conversation that felt long overdue. Robert started the bus, and they pulled away from the stop. The familiar route unfolded before them, but Thaddeus saw it with new eyes. He noticed the passengers around him, some with tired faces, others lost in thought. He felt a sense of responsibility stirring within him. I've noticed how patient you are with everyone, Thaddeus said, glancing at Robert. It's inspiring. Robert chuckled softly, hands steady on the steering wheel. Thank you, Thaddeus. Everyone has their battles. Sometimes, a small act of kindness can make a big difference. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of a young mother struggling to keep her children calm. See that woman? She's juggling a lot. A smile or a kind word can lighten her load. Thaddeus nodded, absorbing Robert's words. I want to learn how to do that. I want to help people, not hurt them. Robert turned slightly in his seat, his expression serious. It's not just about helping, Thaddeus. It's about understanding. You have to listen to their stories. Everyone has a reason for being who they are. As they drove on, Thaddeus observed the passengers more closely. He noticed an elderly man, his hands shaking as he held onto the pole for support. Thaddeus remembered how he had once ignored such details, too consumed by his own world. Now, he felt a pull to reach out. He leaned over to Robert. "Can I say something to him? Just a greeting?" Thaddeus's voice was tentative, but filled with determination. "Absolutely," Robert encouraged, nodding. "That's a great start." With a deep breath, Thaddeus stood up, stepping carefully down the aisle. He approached the elderly man, who looked up in surprise. "Hi there, sir. How are you today?" The man blinked, taken aback by the young heir's sudden kindness. "Oh, I'm doing all right, thank you. Just taking it one day at a time." Thaddeus smiled, feeling a sense of connection. "That's all we can do, right? I hope you have a good day." The man returned the smile, his eyes lighting up. "Thank you, young man. That means a lot." Returning to his seat, Thaddeus felt lighter. He glanced at Robert, who was watching him with pride. "You did well," Robert said, a hint of a smile on his lips. Small steps lead to big changes. As the bus made its way through the city, Thaddeus continued to engage with the other passengers. He asked questions, listened to their stories, and offered words of encouragement. Each interaction filled him with a sense of purpose he had never known before. After a few stops, Thaddeus returned to Robert, his excitement bubbling over. "I never realized how much I could learn from just talking to people. It feels good." Robert nodded, his eyes sparkling with approval. "You're discovering the power of connection, Thaddeus. Keep it up, and you'll find that empathy opens many doors." The bus ride ended, but Thaddeus's journey had only just begun. He stepped off the bus, feeling renewed, knowing that he was on a path of understanding and growth. He turned back to Robert, who was watching him with a knowing smile. "Thank you for everything, Robert," Thaddeus said sincerely. "Just remember, Thaddeus, change takes time, but it starts with one small step," Robert replied, a proud mentor in the making. As Thaddeus walked away, he felt a sense of belonging. The lessons he learned on that bus were more than just words. They were the foundation of a new beginning, one built on kindness, respect, and a deeper understanding of the world around him. Share this story if you believe that kindness can transform lives and create meaningful connections. Leave a comment about a time when a small act of compassion made a difference in your life, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one.